It seems hard to believe, but I think I may actually be speechless. Hey, welcome back to the Colorblind Architect Podcast. I'm your host, David, and yes, I am wearing sunglasses right now, right from the beginning of the video, because it is so freaking bright out today. It's the most beautiful blue sky day, don't get me wrong. However, my eyes tend to get a bit sensitive with really bright sunshine, and so I have to have sunglasses on, or else I'll be squinting this whole entire video. And so, anyways, the speechless part was kind of an interesting way to start, because, yeah, if you know me, I'm rarely speechless, but it does make me a bit speechless to think about what I'm about to talk about. And I say that, I'm prefacing that, because you're probably thinking, well, what are you going to talk about, Dave? Actually, if anybody's actually watching this, you're probably thinking, this guy sucks. Yeah, I know. I try very hard to be so lame. But anyways, no, what got me speechless was I was listening to the next chapter in the Jordan Peterson Beyond Order book. This is an amazing audiobook, and if you have not gone out and gotten it, man, it is such a good book. The last chapter that I went through was talking about this need to get things that are deep and dark and write them down completely and get them out. Don't hide them in shadows, basically. And then he talked about this, a series of patients, and talked about their incapacity to recognize evil. They would even openly say that they believe in, everybody being good. And it got me thinking, are there really people like that? Are there really people that have a hard time believing that there are evil people in the world? And then you start to think, well, maybe that's true. I mean, obviously you've got the naive Pollyannas, the people who just, they hear no evil, see no evil, they feel like everybody's essentially good. Yeah, there's a lot of people like that. But even just down to political philosophies, if you look at a political philosophy such as authoritarian leftism, which a lot of people don't realize that they're supporting authoritarian leftism, or even authoritarian right wing. It doesn't matter. If you're believing in an authoritarian system, you're believing that there is no capacity for evil. Because why else would you accept somebody to lord over you if you thought that people were corruptible? And I thought here in America that most people were, essentially of the belief that people are corruptible. And because people are corruptible, we need to have systems in place, checks and balances, so forth. But if you believe in, for example, these people who believe that we just need more power to the government. Well, if you believe that we need more power to the government, then you believe essentially that corruption doesn't occur, that people are essentially good. And even though you might mentally accept that premise, and you might even say that you accept the premise that people are corruptible and that people can be evil, but then you go and support big government, thinking, oh yeah, big government can never be evil. And I can't help but wonder why. Why would you look at for example, just take North Korea. It's an authoritarian, repressive, despotic regime. And, the people suffer there. They're in a form of slavery. And it boggles my mind that there are people who don't see the possibility of that happening in a place like this. Now, it makes you wonder, are these people just racist? Do they really think that because we're a predominantly white country that that's not possible? I don't know. Maybe. But then what about the Nazis in Germany? What about the Soviets in Russia? It's not like this hasn't happened in European-based cultures. It's happened all over the world. Every culture sometimes falls into despotism. Even in America, we fell into despotism under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, it was a mild form compared to what happened in Germany or in Russia during the same period, but it was still a form of authoritarianism, and a lot of evil was done. If you don't believe me, read Amédée Schle's book, The Forgotten Man, an excellent book to read. And it actually talks about some of the horrible things that happened during the Great Depression as a result of government policies instituted by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the aims of alleviating poverty, but it actually just made it worse. And it actually suppressed people's rights. It took away, there was stuff so stupid as like people having to kill off chickens and not provide them as food to people because of government policies. There were things like you couldn't even sell your chickens if you didn't have like a particular license or something like that. And there's a lot of other examples, butchers, for example, who were put out of business because they weren't unionized or something, crazy stuff like that. And I could be misremembering the details. It's been a few years since I read The Forgotten Man, but it is definitely a good book to read to understand how there are a lot of bad things that can happen in a republic like ours, even though we have the checks and balances. So it's even worse when you have an authoritarian regime. So I think back to, what I was starting this off by saying, that some people have a hard time believing in the capacity to do evil. And I believe that part of that is that there are a lot of people that they believe that somehow people are perfectible in this life, that somehow if we can just set all the scenarios right and we encourage people to be good, that somehow people are going to be good. And they're totally forgetting the fact that there's always going to be evil. There's always going to be people who choose to do wrong. Okay? You can't stop it. It's like this whole gun control narrative. These people think that, oh yeah, we're just going to control guns. We're going to put these gun control laws in. Well, okay. Yeah, some gun control laws make sense. Like, for example, trying to prevent mentally ill people from possessing firearms is probably not a bad idea, since that is where a lot of the gun violence comes from, right? But on the flip side, where does it say in the Constitution that a mentally ill person doesn't have the right to keep and bear arms? That's one of those tough questions, right? Obviously, I don't think anybody wants a homicidal maniac to have a gun. But on the flip side, how do you know who the homicidal maniacs are? How do you know when that's going to happen? it's a much more complex question than just saying, oh, well, okay, they've been declared mentally unfit. Well, what happens if the mental health industry becomes corrupt and they start declaring people to be unfit just to get them to not have their guns anymore? Well, that could be a problem, right? Oh, but the mental health industry, they're not going to become corrupt. Really? Really? So you really don't see any possibility, any way, any scenario where the health care industry in general can become corrupt? We've only seen it this whole last year, right? Where they've been mysteriously not logging any flu-related deaths. In fact, they haven't even been relating flu-related incidents in the past year because the financial structure, the incentives, have been in favor of logging those as COVID, even if it's the flu. Now, here's the thing. The flu's been around for over 100 years. Since the Spanish flu epidemic, we've known about the flu. We have regular, every year, roughly 60,000 Americans die of the flu every year. And yet, all of a sudden there's zero in 2020. But there's this huge spike in COVID deaths. And you have to wonder, well, are some of those COVID deaths maybe flu deaths? Is it possible that the healthcare industry could have been corrupted, and as a result, this lie is taking place? And so when I talk about the mental health industry, is there any chance that it could become corrupt? Well, I don't know if you've ever seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's a movie with Jack Nicholson years and years ago. Great film, by the way. Or maybe you've heard of the old sanitariums and asylums of days of yore. In the old days, there was a lot of really creepy, evil stuff going on by these doctors and nurses to these mentally ill patients. There's a lot of evil that takes place. And to think that just because most doctors, most psychiatrists are essentially good people, doesn't mean that they don't commit evil. And it also doesn't mean that there aren't also evil doctors, right? There are people who just are completely corrupt a-holes. And so, I guess this is a long way of saying that, yes, evil exists. And to think that evil doesn't exist, and to assume that we can just ascribe all this power to people that are corruptible, it indicates a lack of ability of people to see evil for what it is. It is a very real thing. So, what's the solution? Well, the solution is having a system of checks and balances. And if the current system of checks and balances is insufficient for you to be able to stop said evil, then we need to figure out, okay, well, what is it about whatever evil this is? What is it that is preventing us as a society from stopping the evil and reducing its impact? Chances are it's a lack of checks and balances, and it's a lack of proper incentives. Because, for example, the drug lords in Mexico, you know what they're doing lately? They've been selling avocados. Why? Because it's actually more profitable now for them to sell avocados than it is for them to sell drugs. Why? Well, the incentives changed. The prices changed. So that's become what's most profitable to them. You think these drug lords in Mexico, they're just, oh no, we're just all about selling drugs? No, ultimately they just want to make a lot of money. Now, are they evil? Yeah, in many ways they are, because their tactics are evil. They treat people like trash. They kill people. They murder people. They commit acts of theft, and they commit acts of violence. So yeah, there's a lot wrong with the Mexican cartels. However, right now they're selling avocados, which is objectively not evil. Now, I don't know about their particular methods of doing it. Maybe their particular methods are evil, but the point is that, yeah, if the incentives change, a lot of times behavior changes. Now, but you also still have to have a system of checks and balances. And this is where I differ from a lot of my more libertarian and conservative friends. And, I tend libertarian and conservative myself. I do believe in having as much freedom for the individual as possible within reason. However, to be able to avoid the problems of the excesses of somebody using their liberty in order to exploit others, you have to have a system of regulations and enforcement of those regulations in order for a proper functioning society. And so, what happens when the police become corrupt? For example, the FBI. It's pretty obvious that the FBI has become quite corrupt in the past 10 years. It may have been for longer, but that's what I'm aware of. It seems like there's a lot of corruption in the FBI. And it's not to say that every FBI agent is corrupt. No. In fact, I would imagine that the majority of them are probably good, honorable people. However, yeah, there's obviously some corruption there. Same thing with the CIA. Same thing with the NSA. Same thing with your local police department. There's a chance that there's corruption. And to not recognize that there's a possibility of corruption, to not recognize that there's a possibility of evil, indicates a lack of a sense of reality. We all have the capacity to do evil. And so, what do we do about it? Like I said, we need to get better, robust systems of checks and balances and enforcement of regulations. We need good regulations, though, because we want the regulations to provide the correct incentives, right? You don't want to try to enforce a law and then not have correct incentives. If you have the wrong incentives, if the incentives still favor disobeying the law, no amount of enforcement is going to stop the problem, right? So it's a two-prong attack that you have to have. You have to have good regulations, and usually that means less regulations that are intelligible regulations. That's one of the problems, too, that we have, is that the more people become corrupt, the more we feel that we need to legislate all these things. We need to legislate every little nook and cranny of morality. And as a result, we end up with so many laws that it becomes possible that a good and honorable, decent person could actually be caught up and arrested and jailed for doing good things that are technical infractions of the law, while you have verifiably evil people who are let off because they're not technically committing violations of the law. And that is a problem too. So, simplified regulation, checks and balances, and well-enforced regulations. These are things that we need. Yeah, I want people to be as free as they can be. Unfortunately, to have the ultimate freedom, we would need everybody to be as honorable, decent, and good as possible. Because this is where the libertarians fail every time. Libertarians fail because they fail to recognize the evil capacity of people and the fact that we have to have laws and regulations in order to combat the corruption of mankind. However, the current system is way too regulated and overly corrupt in the regulation. That doesn't work either. So how do we get to a place where we're in a better situation? Well, again, you gotta start locally. Start where you can. Promote good laws in your own hometown. Do what you can to make it better yourself. And also learn. Learn as much as you can. You know, don't just follow the memes. Don't just follow the talking heads or the radio hosts or whatever source you have for your primary news. You need to get educated as you can and promote goodness. And finally, be real about yourself. Recognize in yourself the capacity to do evil. It's a scary thing to recognize that you have the capacity to do evil. It's always been a big struggle for me too, because obviously we all believe that we want to believe that we ourselves are good, decent people. But the truth is, we aren't. We may be trying to be, but we always have that part of us, that capacity to do evil. That if we leave it unchecked, if we're unaware of it, if we let it just fester and be completely unaware of it, we become monsters in our own right. And when we become monsters in our own right, and as Jordan Peterson likes to put it, an unbelievably unaware monster, right? This is the thing that I love about the way Jordan Peterson puts that. An unbelievable unaware monster is somebody who is not analyzing their life. They're not analyzing their own complicity in the evil of the world. They're not accepting the possibility that they themselves might be contributing. And as a result, because they're not analyzing this, and because they're not laying out in front of themselves what is the evil that they themselves are committing, or the capacity thereof, it just grows unchecked and it just exists. And this evil, it doesn't define somebody. See, here's the thing. You're not defined by your capacity or your proclivity towards evil. You're defined by whether or not you try to stop it. And that is the key. You gotta be working on it daily. Identifying those sources of evil in your life and weeding them out one by one. By identifying them, recognizing that they exist, and figuring out what you need to do internally to eliminate those from your life. And part of that means that you've got to take action by creating fences, creating barriers for yourself. Now, here's where religions oftentimes get it wrong. Religions oftentimes will try to present the idea that here's what you got to do. You know, one of the things that was wrong with the law of Moses was that it explicitly said all these things. Like if you look at Leviticus, and it listed out thousands and thousands and thousands of laws. And these were all the things that you had to do, the do's and don'ts, right? And it was codified. Well, the problem with codifying all those laws is it assumes a one-size-fits-all solution to everything. And as we all know, in every law, there is an exception to what actually is sensible. There's always an exception to every law. Just take, for example, something like murder. Yeah, we say murder's wrong, right? Okay, then what about soldiers fighting in a war, killing somebody intentionally? Is that not murder? Well, technically it would be. Now, granted, in a war, you could very easily be fighting a war of defense, and in that case, you are morally justified in that action, right? But on the flip side, yeah, we don't want to just willy-nilly say, yeah, this is always right. You can always do this. No, that murder's wrong, right? Okay. So I guess my point is, there's exceptions to every rule. Like, never tell a lie, right? Well, except if your wife asks you if she looks fat. You lie every time, no matter what you're thinking or feeling at the time. You just immediately say, no, honey, you're beautiful to me. Now, if my wife is watching this, yes, you are beautiful all the time. And look, it's not to say that that's actually a falsehood either. It's just if your immediate reaction is, to your significant other asking you, do I look fat, or how do I look in this outfit? And you're thinking to yourself, I don't like this. It's not looking right. A little more work maybe would be useful, but that's going to cause more harm than it would do good, right? So you kind of just say, you're beautiful to me, right? That's a small white lie example, right? And I try to avoid those, and my wife's pretty good about accepting me being kind of a idiot, because I am kind of an idiot, and sometimes I just blurt out what I'm thinking. Like, usually when she's like trying to compare two dresses and saying which one looks better on me, and they both look fine, or she puts one on and I'm thinking, well, it's not the most flattering look, but hey, you're still beautiful to me. It's like, and how do you say that? It's like, because on the one hand, it could just be the particular mood I'm in that day, and I might just think everything is horrible, just because I'm in a bad mood. I might have constipation, right? So the point being is that you can't codify, you can't write down laws for every single thing, every single situation, and nor is that even good. For you, in particular, you are going to know your own specific needs, right? Your own specific weaknesses. So, for example, I know that I have certain weaknesses that I'm aware of, that as a result, I create my own rules for myself so that I stay away from those situations where that weakness becomes a problem for me. So there's just certain areas, certain places I will not go, right? For example, if I see that my wife is in a bad mood, I don't try to argue with her at that time. I just say, yes, dear. Why? Because I have enough experience to know that my weakness is to attack and attack and attack and just try to win an argument. which is exactly the wrong thing to do, especially if I know that my wife is not feeling the best emotionally or spiritually. And if I try to win the argument, I'm going to lose my wife, right? So instead, I will just concede, let her have that, right? That's something that I recognize in myself as a weakness, a tendency of wanting to win arguments. And sometimes that's not the right choice. Sometimes the right choice is to concede. Sometimes the right choice is to not win so that you can win the bigger prize of having a good relationship. There'll be time to work it through. And especially with my wife, she usually corrects herself on her own. I don't have to tell her to. And plus, that's kind of mansplaining. It's kind of not a very appropriate thing for me to do as a man, to be telling her how to live her life or how to behave, right? Because she's a smart woman. She'll figure it out on her own. So what I do, I've learned to just back off, let her have her space, and if she's wrong, she figures it out. If I'm wrong, I hope to God I figure out. Usually she helps me figure it out. Yeah. And that's one of the things that I love about her, and that's one of the reasons why, I try to back off, and I try to learn to respect her opinions, because a lot of times she has a sixth sense about things that I don't, that I'm completely oblivious to. And I would imagine that it's like that for a lot of us, that we all have these weaknesses that we need to recognize those weaknesses, learn to recognize them, and learn to build fences around those weaknesses so that we don't enter into it. So for example, if you know that you have a tendency to drink too much, then maybe your solution is to quit drinking alcohol, right? You might be an alcoholic. Well, then you need to abstain, because if that's your tendency, that's your weakness, and you know it destroys you, then even though it might be acceptable for other people to drink, for you personally, you might have to choose, no, for me, I will not. For me, that's something that I choose. I choose not to partake in drugs or alcohol, not because I think that everybody should avoid them. I mean, personally, I think most people are better off if they avoid it. But generally speaking, I'm not going to tell other people that they can't smoke marijuana, for example. But for me, I choose not to, because I know within myself there's a seed, there's a little part of me that would become addicted and overdo it if I do anything like that. So I avoid things like that so that I can stay clean and pure from those negative impacts on my life. And there's a lot of examples like that. And so this is a long-winded way of basically saying that our weaknesses and our evils are things that we need to recognize, we need to lay out there and be real about. Accept the fact that they exist, and then formulate strategies and rules for yourself. So that, and these are internal rules, right? Not for other people. Don't enforce on other people. If you think that veganism is the way to go, then don't force me to eat vegan. Because I happen to like my beef, okay? I like eating beef. And you know what? That's my choice, okay? You can do it your way too. I'm not going to force you to eat beef, even though I like it, So that's the way it should be, right? And that would be the ideal libertarian scenario. But again, it comes down to needing everybody to be working towards being the best version of themselves that they can be. Anyways, gone long, but hopefully this has been helpful. Hopefully you find some value in it. If not, I'm guessing that you'll just ignore it like most videos, because frankly, yeah, it doesn't seem like most people even want to listen to me talk, which is okay. Like I said, I do these not for you. I do these so that I can express myself, get my thoughts out, lay them out, and hopefully help some other people along the way. But mostly it's so that I can create a discipline of thinking clearly and formulating my thoughts. And that's something that I highly recommend to you as well, if you're watching, to do so. Whether it be through writing things out or, speaking out, just find a way to discipline your thoughts and come to know yourself well enough to overcome your weaknesses and your evils. And with that, I leave you again for another day. I'm the Colorblind Architect. Peace out.